We go to the hotline. Bill Bender of the Sporting News joining us. Bill, good morning, sir.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Well, doing well, man. So no spoilers, but I was told by one of our producers that you have seen the Johnny doc. So your thoughts on it?
Oh, it moves fast. It was a good. It doesn't seem like it was that long ago. It actually seems to me like it was yesterday. And the one thing I will say, and as a kid that grew up in Ohio, Johnny Manziel made an impact up here. Okay, so like he was so polarizing. I always go back to this, not the first Alabama game, the second one, where half of my buddies were rooting for Alabama, which how does that happen in Ohio? And half of them were rooting for Johnny Manziel to light up Alabama. And it's one of the most anticipated regular season games I can ever remember. And that was the impact he had as a cultural icon. And this really dives into that from his high school days through his NFL downfall and everything in between.
How I've always found Johnny, and maybe because I have maroon goggles when I watch him, but so likable in interview settings. And how does he come across?
Yeah, I mean, very candid, very open. That was the other surprising part in this is there's some language, which, for me, it's not that big of a deal. But I mean, the high school highlights were awesome. You look, they dive into his high school career a little bit, and you see just how much, and it's kind of fitting that it's happening this week. You see the impact that Johnny Manziel made and bringing Texas A&M into the SEC, and with all the realignment going on, some programs better have something like that as they dive into new conferences. We did an article last week. It's not easy when you jump from conference to conference in this 21st century college football environment.
I think the timing of it too, right? The swagger that Kevin Sumlin brought to Texas A&M those years, and to back that up with a quarterback who is his redshirt freshman year, he was very. They didn't put him out there in the limelight, but I think that started adding to his legend.
Oh, for sure. And that did because there was a mystique about him. I do remember that at Sporting News, like we were trying to do profiles of Johnny Manziel and you couldn't talk to him. So my editor at the time, John Turner, had worked in Kerrville somehow. So he did this long profile winding about John. He had actually covered Johnny in high school and put those thoughts on paper. It was a wonderful feature at the time because we were all curious. And like I said, you didn't see players like him much. Now today, 2023, you'd be like, oh, there's a dual threat quarterback. He's like Johnny Manziel. He was the first one where you watched, and your last caller was the memories I have are that like a lot of how did he do that? How did he get down the field? This is amazing to watch, and he did all that, and it all they spend a considerable amount of time on that first Alabama game, and when they went up 20-0, I think the entire college football world was put on notice at that point.
Again, I haven't watched it, but I'm assuming they may touch on it. Maybe they don't. But the Duke game, that last bowl game he played in, I remember thinking at halftime, like, he's Johnny Manziel. He's going to figure this out, and we're going to get back into this game. But also wondering, God, what is this going to do for his resume? Like, how are people going to look at him now, leaving on that note?
Right, and well, they didn't spend a lot of time on a few things. They didn't talk about his recruitment too much, which I was always interested in that story. Obviously, how he wound up at Texas A&M. They touched briefly on Texas. I can tell you one. They don't spend a lot of time on it, but this is another moment I remember. I was sitting in the Sporting News office, and when the Dallas Cowboys were on the clock, and we all thought that Johnny Manziel was going to be in a Dallas Cowboys uniform, I remember looking at Twitter and it looked like Wheel of Fortune at the time. It was just constant tweets going up. And of course, he ends up Cleveland, which is up my way. It didn't work out. And some of that's not on Johnny. That was an organization at the time and still on some level that was an absolute mess.
Bill, last thing on Johnny, had he gone to maybe a different situation, had he maybe had a little bit better counseling, what kind of NFL career could he have had?
I mean, it would have been interesting to see. And I think he landed in probably the absolute wrong spot that he could land. Now, if Dallas drafts him and there's a plan in place to have him maybe follow Tony Romo at the time, it may have been different because, some of that you see close to home, maybe he has the support system in Texas that he didn't have in Ohio. But I mean, as he brings out in the documentary, a lot of it at the end of the day was him confronting the problems that he had and not being in control of the celebrity that he created. I think the one thing that sticks out in this documentary is we haven't seen a college football celebrity since Johnny Manziel like him. I mean, even like Trevor Lawrence,
Yeah.
and I'm running through a couple, Bryce Young, they weren't in the national consciousness nearly as much as Johnny Manziel was because of that polarizing nature.
Bill Bender, Sporting News, with us. All right, let's turn our attention to some football matters. Just, I want to kind of touch on SEC quarterbacks. I did a whole segment on, like, when you look at the college football in general, like, there's a lot of new starting quarterbacks around the top 25, the coaches poll that came out. And I think we counted, 7 or 8 different starting situations. And we kind of looked at it as, based on your history, determines the kind of good grace that you're going to get in these rankings. When you look at the SEC in particular, who do you think? And some people think Jaden Daniels, some people think KJ Jefferson. Who do you think is the best quarterback in the conference?
Well, if you go on experience, it's Jaden Daniels right now. Like, he had a little bit of a breakout. Now, if you look at Jaden Daniels from week 1 against Florida State versus Jaden Daniels in a bowl game, there was a jump, there was a development, there was a lot of things. Now, if you're looking at some upside picks, you would have to look at Joe Milton in that Tennessee offense, where he looked pretty good in the bowl game, but he doesn't have the same experience. Alabama, Georgia breaking in new quarterbacks. I think Wigman's another one. I mean, limited sample size, huge upside in that offense. And that's the two most interesting quarterbacks to me, but while not the best right now, would probably be Joe Milton and Connor Wigman.
Talking to Bill Bender here on TexAgs Radio. So I know the last time we had you on, you were somewhat high on Texas A&M's potential this year. After hearing Bobby Petrino speak, after SEC Media Days, where are you with the direction of that offense and what this team can be?
Oh, I mean, high upside. I think last time I was on, I talked about the curiosity factor I have for this offense with the 5-star talent. I love watching receivers. I want to see if Evan Stewart's that breakout guy in this offense. Reuben Owens is another 5-star talent that, how much did they give him the ball? I'm always fascinated by running backs that average more than 5 yards per carry. And, with Wigman on top of that, and they have some talent up front, and with Bobby Petrino, I mean, for all of the talk about the relationship between Bobby Petrino and Jimbo Fisher, it gets lost that Bobby Petrino is definitely a brilliant offensive mind.
Talking to Bill Bender here, TexAgs Radio. All right, let's talk about the Armageddon happening there in conference expansion. Yesterday was Friday was ridiculous. I'm doing the show and we're getting reports. It looks like they're fixed. All going to be good at the Pac-12. And then a couple hours later, teams are bolting. And then yesterday, I'm reading about the ACC maybe trying to get Stanford and Cal. Just give us your take on where things stand and where you think they may head.
Friday was just so wild. I'm still like picking up the pieces from Friday, where you saw a conference basically ripped apart. And it's a conference that existed since 1915. We haven't had a season where it would be the last year for a conference since the Big East. You guys can relate down there. I mean, there are people that I think if you gave them truth serum, they would go back to the Southwest Conference days because of the regionality and the feel, and having 8 Texas schools in the same place. I was saying this earlier, realignment doesn't work for everybody. Texas A&M is an instance where it did. Their winning percentage in the 11 years they've been in the SEC versus the 11 years before has gone up by 123. So I think that's something to keep in mind. But they're one of 4 schools that have flipped conferences since 2000 in the Power 5. Only 4 of the 15 have increased their winning percentage. It's not easy. And that's something to remember. When Oregon and Washington, I'm a Big Ten guy, my friends aren't excited about Oregon and Washington coming to the Big Ten. They don't want to stay up that late.
So what do they do? Like, I mean, do you think Cal and Stanford end up at some point getting invited to one of the 2 big ones? Do you think they're just going to have to be renegades for the next couple of years? Does the ACC thing even make sense at all? What do you think happens with Florida State and Clemson?
Sounds like that ACC at least is being talked about. And, the presidents are going to vote on this. We'll see how it goes. But, I mean, the travel concerns have to be there, right? I mean, how have you Stanford, you go play at NC State. Do you go back home before you come back and go play at Syracuse or Boston College? It's just, the geography part is interesting to me because the new age of college football has taken some of that geography away, but that's what this sport thrives on, regional rivalries. I mean, for me, it's the ACC doesn't need to go all the way out west if it's just for a TV grab to get a late night TV slot. That part of the country, the ACC and SEC in particular, they're going to dominate the South. they're going to dominate those time zones. And then it's going to be on the Big Ten. The one thing about this move is they are going to have programming from noon through 2 a.m. with what Pac-12 After Dark is going to become Big Ten After Dark, and that's one of the moves. Is it worth it? I don't know. We'll see in 5 years.
Talking to Bill Bender here on TexAgs Radio. Penn State's the team that came up when we're talking about new quarterback situations and what those teams can do. Are you high on what Penn State might be able to do in 2023?
Well, they got to beat Ohio State and Michigan. It comes down to that. This is as talented a Penn State team as they've had since that 1994 team that went 12-0. They got Drew Aller. They're really high on him. Connor Wigman, Drew Aller, they should meet each other because the expectations, the arm talent, the 5-star recruiting background, I think it's very similar. They've got a ton of help around him with this sophomore class. They've got a difference maker that'll play in the NFL on every level of their defense. And I say all that, and they've still got to go beat Michigan and Ohio State. James Franklin is 4-14 against the Buckeyes and Wolverines. And, it's kind of the same thing as last year. They went 10-2, won the Rose Bowl, but they lost to Ohio State and Michigan. It will be a lot of fun up here with that triangle of teams, though. Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, all definitely legitimate playoff contender type teams.
Talking to Bill Bender here on TexAgs Radio. Michigan is a team that, I'm so high on that backfield as I should be. I'm so high on J.J. McCarthy. Regardless of what happens with Harbaugh and his suspension, I really feel like they are the team again in the Big Ten. Am I wrong?
No, it's building to this. They will have to go to Penn State. That won't be easy. They have to go to Michigan State. And as strange as that sounds, that's been a tough spot for them in recent years. Michigan State plays gives them their best shot typically. They got Ohio State coming in. Ohio State's got a ton of first-round talent, but everything you said is true. This is the best backfield in the nation between McCarthy and Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards. They have, I read something a couple weeks ago, they have as many as 8 offensive linemen that might get drafted. Wow. So right there, up front, they should be absolutely dominant. Is their defense good enough to do this again? I think so, but the question is no longer Ohio State, and they still have to go out and beat Ohio State. Don't get me wrong. The question now is, can Jim Harbaugh beat an SEC school in a bowl game? They have not done that yet. They beat Florida his first year. They haven't done it since. And can they go out and beat a Georgia or beat an Alabama, or even they lost to South Carolina one year? And I think that's the question I have for this roster. Do they have enough 4- and 5-star talent to go out and beat an SEC powerhouse? And they're asking that pretty openly in Ann Arbor this year.
You mentioned earlier when you said Drew Aller and Connor Wigman kind of in the same breath. I'd put Cade Klubnik in that same regard. What do you expect from Clemson this year? Garrett Riley's there. Cade's taken over. He took over at the end of last year, and their expectations.
Well, they are still the ACC champion. I think they are being a little, I'm not going to say underrated, but undersold a little bit because everybody's talking about Florida State and Jordan Travis and Keon Coleman and this loaded Florida State roster. Florida State, they are such a boomer bust team. At the end of September, if they beat LSU and Clemson, you could probably pencil them into the playoff.
Right.
If they lose both of those games, then it becomes Clemson's conference again in some ways. Cade Klubnik, you said, right, belongs in that discussion with those guys. Super high upside. Ton of NFL talent on the defensive side of the ball, beginning with Jeremiah Trotter Jr., loaded defensive line, good D-backs. To me, it's still Clemson's the ACC favorite until somebody shows us otherwise.
Last thing for you, DJU there. I always struggle with this name, so I just DJU it. Oregon State's a team that I keep reading. People are like, they might be a little salty there. What are your thoughts on Oregon State?
Well, a lot of people are going to be rooting for them now, with them being the left in the Pac-12 and DJ Uiagalelei. I've learned through 2 years, so don't feel bad. I've had to say that name so many times. It could be a good fit, and it's one of those closer to home, on the other side of the country, something to keep in mind when all these student athletes are moving all around the country with the new realignment. And this was a very talented team that just smacked Florida in the bowl game last year. Jonathan Smith's taken the long way in rebuilding them. Won't be surprised at all if they make a run. They've got a friendly schedule, too. They go to Oregon at the end of the year. That could be a game that decides who goes to the Pac-12 championship game. There's no question. And like I said, a lot of the country is going to be rooting for the Beavers, who have been left out of the realignment mix.
Bill, as always, great stuff, man. Thanks for your time.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for having me on. Take care.
You too. Bill Bender there from the Sporting News. Appreciate his time here on TexAgs Radio.